My late husband, Liam, was a planter of trees. It was, aside from his encyclopedic knowledge of bad puns, his defining characteristic. When we bought this house 15 years ago, the backyard was a barren patch of sun-scorched clay. Liam saw it as a canvas on our first weekend here. Before we had even unpacked the kitchen, we planted the oak. It was a tiny sapling, no thicker than my wrist, a hopeful little stick against the vast, empty sky. Oaks are for permanence, Evie, he'd said, tamping down the soil around its base. This one will be here long after we are. It's our anchor. He was half right. The oak was still here, strong, magnificent, its branches reaching for the clouds, its leaves a dappled canopy that turned the harsh afternoon sun into a gentle, shifting mosaic on the grass below. But Liam was gone. A quiet, sudden betrayal of the heart 2 years ago had taken him. Lave in May we to Jose, the garden we'd built together, and the oak our anchor. My garden was my sanctuary as a landscape architect. It was also my laboratory and my art gallery. It was not a manicured, suburban perfect space. It was wild, layered, and full of life. Columbines jostled with ferns, bees droned lazily over lavender bushes, and moss grew in the cracks of the stone patio. It was a place of managed chaos, of life and death and rebirth. It was the only place I still felt close to him. My neighbor to the west, Frank Barrett, did not appreciate managed chaos. Frank appreciated order. Frank appreciated control. His yard was a testament to his worldview, a pudding green perfect lawn, geometrically precise hedges, and a swimming pool so unnaturally blue it looked like a wound in the earth. There was not a leaf out of place, mostly because he was out there every morning with a leaf blower, wagging a relentless wear against nature. Our relationship, for the first year after Liam's death, was one of silent, mutual disapproval over the low, decorative fence that separated our properties. He would scowl at my wildflower patch. I would watch in horror as he sprayed pesticides with the grim determination of a soldier. And then, one Saturday morning, he decided the Cold War needed to get hot. He marched to my front door, his face a mask of pinched indignation, and my life of quiet, grieving solitude came to an end. He had come to talk to me about the tree. Evelyn, he started, dispensing with any pleasantries. Frank was a man who believed in coming straight to the point, especially when the point was his own opinion. We need to talk about that tree of yours ... He said the word tree as if it were a pestilence. I stepped onto the porch, crossing my arms. The oak? What about it? It's a menace, he declared. It's blocking my afternoon sun. My wife, Cynthia, can't get a proper tan. The leaves, Evelyn, the leaves are constantly falling into my pool. I have to run the filter twice as often. It's an expense, and frankly, it's a hazard. A tree that big, a strong wind comes along. Who knows what could happen? I stared at him. He was talking about my anchor, my living monument to my husband, as if it were an overgrown weed. Frank, the tree is perfectly healthy, and it's been there for 15 years. Your pool has been there for 3. That's irrelevant. Has snapped. The situation has become unacceptable. It needs to come down. The casual arrogance of it, to sheer unadulterated entitlement, took my breath away. He wasn't asking, he was telling. He had assessed the situation from his side of the fence and come to a conclusion, and he expected me to simply comply. No. Aside. The word was quiet, but it was firm. I'm not cutting down my tree. A dark flush crept up his neck. Frank was not a man who was used to hearing the word no. I don't think you understand. Evelyn, this isn't a suggestion. That tree is negatively impacting my property value. It's a nuisance. It's a nuisance to you, I countered, my own anger beginning to simmer. To me, it's the heart of my garden. It provides shade. It's a home for dozens of species of birds. It's important. The answer is no. He took a half step closer, his posture aggressive. This is not the final word on this matter. I'll be speaking with the Homeowners Association. We have bylaws, you know, about property maintenance, about nuisances. It was a threat. Plain and simple, he was weaponizing the petty tyrannies of the HOO to get his way. You do that. Frank, aside, my voice as cold as ice, I stepped back inside my house and closed the door, my heart hammering in my chest. The sanctuary had been breached. He had brought his war into my world, and he had made it clear that he would not rest until my tree, my beautiful, strong, permanent oak, was a pile of sawdust. And in that moment, I knew that I would do whatever it took to stop him. My first move was to fight his fiction with facts. I called a certified arborist, a woman named Maria with kind eyes and hands as gnarled as an old root. She spent a full morning examining the oak, testing the soil, checking the limbs for any sign of disease or decay. This tree is in perfect health, Evu, sighed, giving the trunk an affectionate pat. Strong root system, no significant deadwood. No pest. This old girl will outlive us all. Whatever your neighbor is telling you, he's full of it. She wrote up a detailed 7-page report, complete with photographs and scientific terminology. It was a legal document, a testament to the tree's vitality. Armed with it, I felt a surge of confidence. Frank could not argue with science. I made a copy and walked over to his house. My jaw set. Cynthia, his wife, answered the door. She was a thin, anxious woman who always looked like she was bracing for an unpleasant sound. She mirrored Frank's opinions in a softer, more passive-aggressive key. "Oh, Evelyn," she said, her smile not reaching her eyes. "Frank told me you had a little chat. Such a shame about that tree. It really does cast such a shadow. The tree is staying." Cynthia, aside, handing her the envelope. "This is a report from a certified arborist. It confirms the tree is in excellent health and poses no danger whatsoever. I'd appreciate it if you and Frank would drop the matter." She took the envelope as if it were contagious. "Well, I'm sure Frank will want to look at this. He's very thorough." The next day, the report appeared in my mailbox. Scrawled across the front in thick, red marker were 2 words: irrelevant, not the point. The point, I was beginning to understand, had very little to do with the tree. The point was power. The point was that I, a single woman, had defied him, and Frank Barrett could not, would not, let Tet stand. His campaign of petty harassment began. It was insidious, a war of 1,000 tiny cuts. His lawn sprinklers, which had always been carefully calibrated, were suddenly adjusted to spray over the fence, soaking the corner of my patio where I drank my morning coffee. The powerful, gas-guzzling leaf blower he favored was now fired up at 7 a.m. on Saturday mornings, its nozzle aimed directly at the property line, sending a furious whirlwind of dust and noise into my peaceful garden. If I was outside gardening, he would find a reason to be out too. He'd talk loudly on his phone, making pointed comments about unkept yards and neighbors who have no consideration. Cynthia would join in, sighing dramatically about the dreadful amount of leaves she had to skim from the pool. They were trying to make my sanctuary unbearable. They were trying to wear me down, to make my own home a place of anxiety and conflict. My quiet refuge from the world was becoming a battleground. The peace I had so carefully cultivated since Liam's death was being systematically dismantled, leaf by agonizing leaf, and with every passive-aggressive comment, with every early morning blast of the leaf blower, my grief began to curdle into something harder, something colder, something that felt dangerously like rage. The letters from the Homeowners Association started arriving a week later. They were addressed in a crisp, impersonal font, the envelopes bearing the HOO's aspirational logo, a stylized sun rising over a perfectly uniform row of houses. The first letter was a friendly reminder about Bylaw 7.4 regarding yard and landscape maintenance. It spoke of the shared responsibility to maintain a neat and orderly appearance in keeping with community standards. It was vague, but the implication was clear. I ignored it. The second letter, which arrived 10 days later, was more direct. It was an official notice of complaint. It cited a formal complaint from a neighbor. It didn't name Frank, but it didn't have to, regarding overgrown foliage and debris from a large deciduous tree. It requested that I take immediate remedial action. I called the HOA office. I spoke to a woman who sounded bored and overworked. I explained the situation. I told her about the arborist's report. I told her the tree was healthy, and that the complaint was part of a campaign of harassment. We have to respond to all formal complaints. Her voice flat. The board will review the matter at their next monthly meeting. You're welcome to attend. The meeting was a farce. It was held in a small, airless community room. The board consisted of 3 people, a retired dentist who seemed to be asleep, a woman who looked suspiciously like Cynthia's tennis partner, and Frank Barrett himself, sitting there in his official capacity as the HOA's treasurer. He had the grace to recuse himself from the official discussion, but he sat in the front row of the audience, his arms crossed, radiating an aura of smug authority. Made my case. I presented the arborist's report. I spoke about the tree's importance, about Liam, about my right to enjoy my own property. I tried to be calm, reasonable, articulate. Cynthia's friend, the board president, listened with a look of pained sympathy. Evelyn, Dare, we understand your sentimental attachment to the tree. We truly do, but the fact remains. We have a formal complaint from a neighbor. The bylaws are clear. We have to encourage a resolution. The only resolution Frank will accept is for me to cut down a healthy tree. I sighed, my voice rising. That's not a resolution, it's a demand. Well, she sighed, patting a stack of papers in front of her. The board has decided to issue a formal warning. We strongly urge you to work with your neighbor to find a compromise. I walked out of that meeting feeling utterly defeated. I was surrounded. The system was rigged. Frank was using the HOA as his personal blunt instrument, and they were letting him. Word compromise echoed in my head. How do you compromise on the existence of a tree? Cut it in half? That night, I couldn't sleep. I sat in my darkened living room, looking out at the silhouette of the oak against the moonlit sky. Its branches looked like arms, reaching, protecting. It was my anchor, and they were trying to cut the rope. The grief I had been nursing for 2 years, a quiet, constant ache, began to transform. It sharpened. It hardened. It wasn't just about the tree anymore. It was about the invasion, the violation of my home, my peace, my right to be left alone. I would not compromise. I would not surrender. And I would not, under any circumstances, let him wean. The time for being reasonable was over. The time for fighting back had begun. The final straw wasn't a letter or a meeting. It was a fine, a crisp, white invoice from the HOO for $100 for failure to comply with a board directive regarding landscape maintenance. $100. It was a pittance, really, but it wasn't about the money. It was the principle. It was a penalty for my defiance. It was the HOO, under Frank's thumb, telling me that my refusal to capitulate would now have a cost. I stared at the invoice, and the last vestiges of my grief-stricken passivity burned away, leaving behind a cold, hard, diamond-bright anger. I had tried to be reasonable. I had tried to be rational. I had presented facts and made my case, and in return, it had been menaged, patronized, and now fined. The game had changed. If I was going to be penalized for my property, then I would use my property to end this. Once and for all, I was done playing defense. I was done reacting to Frank's moves. I would make a move of my own, a move so decisive, so permanent, that it would be the final word in our little war. My first thought was a lawsuit, but that would be long, expensive, and draining. It would mean months, maybe years of more conflict. I didn't want more conflict. I wanted less. I wanted
silence. I wanted a physical barrier that would end the constant
low-grade warfare. I wanted a wall. I spent the next week in a fever of research. I wasn't a landscape architect who specialized in hardscaping, but I knew the principles, and more importantly, I knew how to read municipal code. I downloaded the entire zoning ordinance for our town. I printed out the 100-plus pages of the HOO's covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the very document they were using against me. I spread them out on my dining room table, slash a highlighter in my hand, and I began to hunt. I was looking for rules about fences, height restrictions, material restrictions, setbacks. The HOO bylaws were, as I expected, restrictive. Fences could be no more than 6 feet high. They had to be made of approved materials, cedar or wrought iron. They required approval from the Architectural Review Committee, of which Iwesura Frank was a member. A 6-foot fence wouldn't solve my problem. It wouldn't block his view of my yard. His constant, silent udement, it wouldn't block the noise of his leaf blower. It was a bandage, not a cure. I was about to give up, and then I found it. It was a small, almost overlooked clause in the municipal zoning code. Under the section for accessory structures, it stated that a standard fence could not exceed 6 feet. However, it went on to say, a structure intended as a privacy screen for a 2-story dwelling could be built up to the roofline of the first story, or a maximum of 20 feet, whichever was less. It was an obscure rule, likely intended for houses on busy streets or next to commercial properties. It was not intended for a quiet, suburban cul-de-sac, and here was the beautiful part. The municipal code superseded the HOA bylaws. State law was clear on that. If the city said it was legal, the AOA could not legally stop me. As long as I followed the proper permitting process, their 6-foot rule was irrelevant. 20 feet, the number sang to me. A 20-foot wall of solid wood. It would not just block Frank's view of my yard. It would block his view of the sunset. It would block his view of the hills beyond. It would plunge his precious, sun-drenched pool into shadow for half the afternoon. It would be a permanent, unassailably and perfectly legal monument to his own belligerence. It was a nuclear option. It was an act of profound, unneighborly aggression. It was perfect. I picked up the phone and called a contractor. The time for research was over. The time for construction was about to begin. The man I hired was named Dave. He was a big, burly man with a calm demeanor and a portfolio full of beautifully crafted fences. I showed him my plans, the printouts of the municipal code, the property survey. He whistled, low and long. 20 feet, huh? Lady, you're not building a fence. You're building the Great Wall of China. What did this neighbor of yours do? But others were secretly on my side. My neighbor on the other side, a quiet woman named Sarah, stopped me while I was getting my mail. I'm not saying I approve of it, she said, gesturing with her head towards the colossal structure, but Frank has been the neighborhood bully for years. It's about time someone stood up to him. So, good for you. She gave me a small, conspiratorial wink, but the victory felt complicated. I had my privacy, but I had sacrificed my view. My yard, once open to the morning sun, was now in deep shade until almost noon. Some of my sun-loving perennials began to suffer. I had won the war, but the battlefield was my own backyard. I would stand on my patio, coffee in hand, and stare at the monolithic wall of wood. It was a monument to my own anger, a 20-foot-tall, 75-foot-long testament to a fight I had never wanted. Had I become as stubborn, as unreasonable as Frank? Had I solved the problem, or had I just built a bigger one? The answer, I realized, was up to me. I was a landscape architect. My job was to create beauty, to soften hard edges, to work with the environment, not against it. This fence, T-stark, aggressive, ugly wall, was now part of my environment. I could let it stand as a symbol of the conflict, or I could transform it. A new idea began to take root, a new project. The fence was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was the largest, most expensive trellis a gardener could ever ask for. I spent the next weekend drawing up plans. I would not be defeated by my own victory. I would turn this act of war into an act of creation. My new project became my obsession. It was the perfect fusion of my grief for Liam and my own defiant resilience. He had planted a tree to anchor us. I would plant a forest to reclaim my peace. I started with the structure. The fence was a blank canvas. I installed a grid of high-tension stainless steel cables running horizontally across the entire length of the fence, spaced about a foot apart. It was a massive, meticulous job, but the result was a sleek, modern trellis system. It turned the flat, boring wall into a surface with depth and potential. Then came the planting. I chose my arsenal with care. For the shadiest sections, I planted climbing hydrangeas, knowing their big, lacy white blooms would glow in the dim light. For the areas that got more afternoon sun, I chose passion flower vines with hair-wheeled, alien-like purple flowers and trumpet vines whose bright orange blossoms would attract hummingbirds. Along the base, I planted a layered border of shade-loving perennials, hellebores, hostas, astilbes, and ferns, a tapestry of different textures and shades of green, designed to soften the hard line where the fence met the earth. But the centerpiece, my own quiet answer to the oak Frank so despised, was te espalier et platres. I bought 3 young trees, bred specifically for the purpose. I planted them in the sunniest part of the yard and began the slow, patient process of training their branches to grow flat against the fence along the wires. It was a living sculpture, a marriage of nature and human intention. It was discipline and passion combined. The work was hard, but it was joyful. It was my work. I was not fighting anymore. I was building. I was creating. My garden was no longer a sanctuary under siege. It was a private, enclosed paradise of my own making. Frank, on the other side of the wall, had gone silent. I never saw him, never heard him. His war was over, and he had lost. I sometimes wondered what he saw when he looked out his window. Just a blank, towering wall of wood, a permanent reminder of his failure. A small, petty part of me took satisfaction in that, but mostly I didn't think of him at all. He was on the other side of the wall. He was no longer part of my world. One evening, a year later, I was sitting on my patio. The sun was setting, and the light was filtering through the leaves of the oak tree. Just as it always had, the climbing hydrangeas had reached the top of the fence in some places, their heavy white blooms cascading down. The apple trees had set their first tiny green fruit. The wall was no longer a wall. It was a living, breathing tapestry of green. I was no longer the grieving widow, hiding from the world. I was the woman who had built a fortress and then turned it into a garden. I had fought a stupid, ugly battle, and I had won. But the real victory wasn't the silence from the other side of the fence. It was the peace on mine. I had taken the ugliest thing in my life and I had made it beautiful. And that, Icknell, was a lesson Liam, the planter of trees, would have been proud of. He complained about my tree. He sighed. Dave just shook his head and grinned. Say no more. Say no more. The process was my new secret mission. I filed the permit application with the city myself. The clerk at the planning department raised an eyebrow at the requested height, but I had my documentation. I had highlighted the specific code. I had a copy of my property survey showing the proximity of my 2-story house to the property line. It was all in order. The permit was approved in 10 days. The HOA was not notified. The city had no requirement to do so. Dave's team was scheduled to start on a Monday. The weekend before, I felt a strange mixture of terror and exhilaration. I was about to irrevocably change the landscape of my home, of my neighborhood. I was about to escalate this petty suburban squabble into something epic. There was a part of me that wanted to back down, to just pay the $100 fine and endure the harassment. But then I would look at the oak, its leaves rustling in the breeze, and I would think of Liam. I would think of his hands in the dirt, the hopeful smile on his face as he planted that sapling. This was not just about a view or some leaves in a pool. This was about defending the last piece of him I had left. On Monday morning, a huge truck full of lumber and concrete bags arrived. The work crew, a team of 4 strong, efficient men, began to unload. Frank came out of his house, a mug of coffee in his hand. He saw the activity and a slow, triumphant smirk spread across his face. He thought he had won. He thought I was finally caving, maybe putting up a small HOA-approved fence as a pathetic peace offering. He sauntered over to the low, decorative fence that separated our properties. "Putting in a fence, Evelyn?" he called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Finally deciding to be a good neighbor?" "Something like that," I said, my voice calm. The crew began their work. The first step was digging the post holes, not the shallow holes of the standard fence, but deep, 4-foot holes with a massive power auger. The sound was a deafening roar that ripped through the quiet morning air, a sound Frank's leaf blower couldn't hope to compete with. Frank's smirk faltered. He watched as they mixed bag after bag of concrete. He watched as they lowered enormous, 24-foot-long, 6-by-6-inch treated posts into the holes, one after another, a line of massive, monolithic sentinels marching down the property line. His face went from smug to confused to utterly horrified. "What the hell is this?" he shouted over the roar of the auger. "What are you building?" I just smiled, a serene smile. "A privacy screen, Frank," I yelled back. "Perfectly legal. I have a permit." Held up the bright orange permit from the city and tacked it to the post nearest him. He stared at it. "He's Mothejigi." He looked at the massive posts. He looked at the stack of lumber. And he looked at me, the woman he had pushed too far. The dawning comprehension in his eyes was the most satisfying thing I had seen in years. The war was not over, but the final battle had just begun. The next 3 days were a masterclass in passive aggression. Frank was in a state of suspended rage, oscillating between sputtering phone calls to the HOA and City Hall, and just standing at his window, watching the construction with a look of pure, impotent fury. He tried everything. He called the city inspector, who came out, looked at my permit, measured the setback, and gave the crew a thumbs up. He called the HOA president, who came over, looked at the permit, and told him, her voice tight with frustration, that there was nothing the HOA could do. The city code trumped their bylaws. He had been outmaneuvered. And heck now the fence went up, panel by glorious panel. It was a solid, board-on-board design, offering 0 visibility. The crew used cedar planks, thick and beautiful, the raw wood smelling sharp and clean in the air. With each vertical foot, Another slice of Frank's world disappeared. First, my garden vanished from his view, then the lower branches of the oak, then the upper branches, then the roofline of my house, and finally the sky. By Wednesday afternoon, it was complete, a solid, unbroken wall of wood, 2 stories high, stretching the entire 75-foot length of the property line. It was magnificent. It was monstrous. It was beautiful. The final panel was slotted into place. The crew packed up their tools, their job done. A sudden, profound silence descended. The roar of the saws and the hammering was gone, and in its place was a quiet I hadn't realized I'd been missing for months. I stood on my patio. The light had changed. My yard was now enclosed. Intimida. The afternoon sun, which had once been harsh and direct, was now filtered, soft. The wall of wood was imposing, yes, but it also created a sense of total, absolute privacy. It was a fortress, my fortress, and then I heard it, a roar of pure, undiluted rage from the other side. Evelyn. I walked calmly to the brand new gate. I didn't open it. I just stood behind it. What have you done? He screamed, his voice muffled by 20 feet of solid cedar. What in God's name is this monstrosity? You've ruined my view. You've blocked out the sun. My property value will be ruined. I believe the technical term is a privacy screen. Frank, I called back, my voice even. I was just following your advice. You seemed so concerned about bylaws and property lines. I decided to take them seriously. This is not over, he bellowed. I will sue you. I will tear this thing down with my bare hands. You can't, Frank, I said, a weary calm settling over me. It's legal. It's permitted. It's built to code. There is nothing you can do. I could hear him sputtering, choking on his own anger. He was a general with no army, a king with no subjects. He had pushed and pushed and pushed, and I had responded by building a wall he could never breach. You know, Frank, I sighed, my voice soft, all you had to do was leave me and my tree alone. That's it. But you couldn't do that, could you? You just had to win. I paused. So, congratulations. I sighed, you won. You finally made me do something about the problem. I hope you enjoy the results. I turned and walked away from the gate, away from his muffled, incoherent screaming. The war was over. I had won. But as I stood in the deep, quiet shade of my brand new fence, I had to wonder what, exactly, the victory had cost me. The first week of living behind the Great Wall of Evie, as I had started calling it in my head, Westrenju. The silence was the most noticeable thing. No more early morning leaf blowers. No more loud, passive-aggressive phone calls. No more feeling of being constantly watched. The ambient noise of Frank's existence had been completely erased. It was a profound, almost unnerving peace. He did not take it lying down, of course. His rage, unable to breach the wall, sought other outlets. He filed a formal complaint with the city, claiming the fence was not to code. The same inspector came out again, took one look, and dismissed the complaint. He filed another complaint with the HOA, demanding they take legal action. The HOO, on the advice of their lawyer, sent him a letter stating they had no legal standing. He had been defeated by the very bureaucracy he had tried to weaponize. The neighborhood was divided. A few of the other residents, the ones who subscribed to Frank's vision of suburban perfection, looked at the fence with horror. I received a few anonymous, huffy notes in my mailbox about property values and community aesthetics.